All right, good evening. How are we this evening? Oh, look at that. Very responsive in the front row. I like that. That's why you're in the front row. So, good evening. My name is Mark Henson. I'm the director of the Brown Institute here at the J School, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Peter Zenger Lecture. This lecture series, and the lecture hall for that matter, was created by Joe Jamail. For those of you who have not heard of him, he was one of the country's most successful plaintiff lawyers. In his practice, Joe Jamail vigorously represented poor and middle-class plaintiffs against corporations. He was equally passionate about the law and journalism as vehicles for working on behalf of justice and civil rights for all. He died in December of 2016 after making a gift to renovate this lecture hall and to establish the Peter Zenger Lecture series. For a little extra piece of history, John Peter Zenger was a New York-based printer and journalist who in 1733 began publishing the New York Weekly Journal, the second paper in New York City, and a publication sharply critical of the corrupt royal governor William Crosby. In a move that should feel familiar to us all, Governor Crosby responded with a proclamation condemning the newspaper's, quote, diverse, scandalous, virulent, false and seditious reflections, unquote, labeling the journalists as evil. John Peter Zenger was accused of libel, a term which then meant publishing any information critical of the government, whether it was true or not. Now, by this definition, Zenger was certain to be convicted, but by finding him not guilty, the jury agreed with Zenger's lawyer, the best in the colonies, I was told at the time, that the truth is quote, the truth is a defense against libel. The decision set an important precedent for the freedom of speech in America. I apologize for the history lesson, but I hope this helps explain why Joe Jamail wanted to name his lecture series after John Peter Zenger. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker in this series, Jonathan Zittrain. Jonathan is the George Bemis Professor of International Law at Harvard Law School and professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, professor of Computer Science at the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, director for the Library and Information Resources at the Harvard Law School Library, and co-founder of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. His research interests include battles for control of digital property and content, cryptography, electronic privacy, the roles of intermediaries within internet architecture, human computing, and the useful and unobtrusive deployment of technology in education. In his most recent publication for the Harvard Business Review, he builds on the idea that the digital world has gone from pull to push. So instead of actively searching for specific things, people read whatever content is in the feeds they see on sites like Facebook and Twitter. What's worse, he argues, is with a virtual concierge like Alexa or Cortana, we might not even get a range of content, but instead a single answer, and one that's increasingly the result of sponsorship. I'm sure we'll hear more about all about this evening. His talk is titled, "The Food is Bad and the Portions Are Big, What to Do About Today's Social Media Platforms." So please join me in welcoming Jonathan Zittrain.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's great to be here tonight. Thank you all for coming. And I don't apologize for a history lesson, or at least a glimpse back into history when it seemed not that long ago that in the public eye, the social media platforms were gooses laying golden eggs. And only recently have we actually been kind of curiously shaking, sniffing, and even tasting the eggs and deciding that there might not be 100% gold in them. And I wanted to think about that. But it started with kind of a vague sense of unease. I would put around 2008 or 2009. It progressed a little bit from there to what I'd call escalating panic as the contents. And then finally, you'd end up with mortal terror, which is pretty much the state of 2018, also represented by a reaction that says, keep on keeping on. And indeed we should, but let's talk about the environment around us and perhaps what to do about it. So what's the problem as best I can describe it with the platforms today? And for that, it helps again to look to the history a little bit. This is now rewind 10 years, 2008. My colleague Yochai Benkler's book, The Wealth of Networks, was very excited. Yochai was very excited about the ways in which the kinds of activities the internet facilitated, including things like Wikipedia, would allow people to bypass the kinds of gatekeepers that previously had prevented new and interesting ideas from coming to the fore. And really what Yochai, I think, was doing was heralding what I call unowned technologies. Technologies that have no particular CEO or business behind them. They're almost collective hallucination technologies that we are all equally able to partake of and contribute to. The internet itself is a collective hallucination technology. It didn't have to be. There were plenty of other things like CompuServe and AOL that could have been that. And the things built on top of the internet, like email, are, again, there's no like 800 number to call if you get an email you don't like to ask Email Inc. to do something about it. Email kind of runs itself among all of those who implement its standards and its protocols. But you know, it's 2018, and now if I had to ask you whether you had to give up email but could use, oh, I don't know, something like Facebook or Twitter for Messenger or direct messaging or anything that these companies has bought, so that includes a number of other applications, how many people would say, no, I would rather give up all of the apps and only have my email account? All right, that's a good half of the room. How many people are like, nah, I'll find another way to do password recovery. I will just use the apps to communicate with people. Ooh, less than half the room. So this is now where I declare the sample to be unrepresentative because it's not the answer I wanted, even though it was the answer I would hope for, because I think there's something to be said for the unowned over the owned. But all right, crowd like this is an advanced crowd, so how about internet relay chat? How many people would insist on continuing to use internet relay chat rather than, say, Facebook and Twitter for communicating instantly with one another? How many people are like, I want my internet relay chat? Okay, one person, with whom are you chatting is the question. And how many people are, give me Facebook and Twitter over that for my okay, so there you go. I had an ace up my sleeve. And of course, the web itself, and I fear like maybe I'll get struck by lightning from Sir Tim if I ask this question, but here's the choice on your mobile device. Either you get to keep Safari and or Chrome, but give up every other app on the device, or you can't get to Safari, Chrome, or another generic browser. You only have your apps. How many people say, give me the browsers and only the browsers? Wow, how many people say, now you're going to feel embarrassed, give me the apps? All right, well, that's good to know. I feel like we're moving towards the world away from the browser and towards the apps, and this group gives me hope that perhaps that's not the case. And of course, a movement towards stovepiped apps rather than the web itself is in fact, say, a movement towards Facebook, because Facebook is now hosting a lot of the content, say, from newspapers that would otherwise be at the end of the web when you click on a link in Facebook. Now it's just taking you back around to more Facebook. Facebook is the cowbell of the music that the internet plays, and we are seeing more and more of it. So there are some holdouts like Wikipedia and like, dare I say, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. They are a collective hallucination, possibly a bad trip, but one that I will not speak further about, except to say they are a classically unowned technology, and a lot of the curious kind of chin scratching we have about them was exactly what we experienced with the internet and the web in a generation prior. Now, back in the old days, Google celebrated the fact that Google could exist because of an unowned technology like the web. So they had this document, 10 things we know to be true. Thing number 4 was that democracy on the web works. And how did they define democracy on the web? That all of us are out there building websites and linking to stuff, and they could just come along and scrape it, and that's how they would know through PageRank what the various sites are that should be listed first. That was what was so exciting to Google. If you now visit their 10 things we know to be true, I love how some lawyer came along inventorying Google's statements to the world that it knows to be true and put up this disclaimer. We first wrote these 10 things when we were just a few years old, so we didn't really know what we were doing. From time to time, we revisit this list to see if it still holds true. We hope it does, and you can hold us to that. I don't know what that means, but I look forward to holding them to their hope. Right. So anyway, in the meantime, what had been an entropic web where you'd click on a link and who knows where you'd end up. It was the Forrest Gump of connective technologies. You could be at a server in one place and click on a link and then suddenly it's in the basement in Belgium. And that's less and less true. So here's the FT's report from last year that Google and Facebook in online digital advertising are slated to account for 84% of all digital advertising dollars spent. That's about, for 2018, just over $100 billion of advertising. 84% of it is going to Google and Facebook outside China. Just for reference, all advertising for newspapers, not just digital, all advertising for the newspaper industry is about $13 billion. So it gives you some sense of the proportions, which is why we find ourselves just looking to traditional media to tell us when Facebook is down. That's the breaking news. She should look happier, right? Like, some more viewers. Welcome from Facebook. Oh, you've already left. Okay. So, and part of that is because what had been something to just share news and views among friends became a vector for sharing capital N news, news of the world news. And I don't even know if Facebook really saw it coming, but you don't just read Facebook, of course, Facebook reads you. So here's a wonderful experiment that Facebook did and released on Valentine's Day about 4 years ago, talking about how it can tell from certain signals on Facebook when two members of Facebook are going to declare a relationship. Before they know, 100 days out, you can start to graph when they're going to be in a relationship, which leads to certain ancillary features or services they could offer, like an in-law early warning system, and then maybe give the in-laws a chance to intervene, and the Romeo and Juliet writes itself. But these are the kinds of things that are really interesting, how much it's learning as you feel you are learning from it. And of course, in this experiment, done off the US congressional elections of 2010, Facebook was able to, in alerting some people, but not others, that it was election day, make a statistically significant impact on who voted, a margin bigger than that of Bush versus Gore. So that's quite interesting. That got me thinking a couple of years ago about whether Facebook could be used to change election results through selective distribution of information. And then I gave up on it. I didn't think there was much to it. But it seemed like a possible interesting thing to pursue. And more recently, in the 2016 election, we saw people within Facebook asking that very question. This is from a town hall meeting at Facebook among employees, and people could vote up the questions that they wanted Mark Zuckerberg at the front of the room to answer. This with 61 upvotes: what responsibility does Facebook have to help prevent President Trump in 2017? And word of this did not end up getting asked to Mark at the front of the room. No surprise there. But word of even the question floating around leaked, and so there was a news story about it, which caused Facebook to write this very carefully Smith statement saying that the company is neutral. We have not and will not use our products in a way that attempts to influence how people vote. Selectively getting out the vote, which was my hypothetical, I'm not sure that speaks to that, but I take the spirit saying Facebook will not try to influence people. And in fact, their studied stance of neutrality is something that we hear a lot about. We're just a technology company. Here's a forum that Mark Zuckerberg did in Italy, and here's one of the questions he was asked about whether Facebook sees itself as an editor or not, and here's his answer.
Hi, my name is Davide Cucurullo, and I'm from Naples. I have a question about the role of Facebook in the media. Do you see it as an editor? Thank you very much.
He's thinking about it.
No. We're a technology company, or we're not a media company. Right, so when you think about a media company, it's, you have people who are producing content, who are editing content, and, that's not us. We're a technology company. We build tools. We do not produce any of the content. We exist to give you the tools to curate and have the experience that you want to connect with the people and businesses and institutions in the world that you want.
All right, So he at least represented that he was thinking about it a little bit before giving the definitive, no, we are definitely not an editor. But of course, Facebook is an editor. They have to make all sorts of choices about what to display to you in the feeds, as Mark was saying in the introduction, and what to allow on their platform. Because more and more, as people are turning to it and all sorts of things are on it, people ask questions about, well, wait a minute, if you could control it, why shouldn't you? Why shouldn't can imply ought, an inversion of Kant's earlier declaration? And this became quite clear when Facebook's formerly secret ways of deciding when something goes down after a complaint has been lodged about it. You say something is abusive, they have a process with a person ultimately behind it, or about 10,000 of them, trying to figure out whether to take something down. And these were not public until some employee leaked them to Julia Angwin, who then published it in The Guardian. And here from the slide deck that is the training deck for people who are going to be content moderators for Facebook are some of the examples. So someone shoot Trump, yes, that will go down. That is not allowed to be posted on Facebook. That's beyond the pale. Kick a person with red hair. That is, in fact, allowed on Facebook because it is a non-specific threat. To snap a Bridget's neck, make sure to apply all your pressure to the middle of her throat. How many people would say that goes down, not allowed? How many people say that's allowed? So the that's allowed, have it. That is allowed in part because under the interpretation of Facebook's rules at the time, this is not telling you or imploring you to do anything. This is simply saying that if and you were wanting to do something, here is a way to do it. The kind of lawyerly distinctions, oh, by the way, let's beat up fat kids, also okay. These are the kinds of things for which there really is elaborated near statutory style law to try to lend some consistency to what goes down and what stays up on Facebook. And once these were released, there was some outrage over some of the answers to the prior questions, and Facebook changed its policies to disallow some of the stuff previously allowed. And if anything, that ratchet goes in one direction. There's less and less that Facebook will allow over time, and they are trying to be more transparent about their editing. But the fact is, whether we're talking about Facebook or Twitter, how these services are architected and how they handle complaints under their so-called terms of service is, of course, an editorial function that they can adopt or not. And at the margins, at the far ends, they're always saying there's stuff they're not going to allow. Now, aside from harassment and abuse, you just have the question of, well, how about just stuff that's like fake and intentionally so for bad reasons, perhaps. So this is just an example of fake news. FBI agents suspected in Hillary email leaks found dead in apparent murder-suicide. Wow, that's a serious murder-suicide. It's a generic photo of a house on fire. And I say this is fake news in a way that I think is beyond contestation in that it comes from the Denver Guardian. I don't know if there's anybody from Denver here. Did you ever subscribe to the Denver Guardian? That's right. It's a trick question. There is no such thing as the Denver Guardian. It doesn't exist as a paper. It doesn't exist online. The online site is but one story and that story. So it's kind of a Potemkin storefront of fake news. And yet, when you look at the number of Facebook shares of the most shared story by newspaper in the heart of the 2016 election season, that one story of the Denver Guardian had just under 600,000 shares on Facebook, while my hometown paper, the poor Boston Globe, with all of its hard-working journalists educated at Columbia Journalism School, had but over 100,000 shares. Now, if you're Facebook and you look at that, is that a problem? And does your answer that you're a technology company and you're just there to give people the products and stuff they need, is that a satisfying answer? Is it a coherent answer when, again, people are just sitting there, they're looking at their news feed. Facebook, what do you want to show them? It turns out Denver Guardian leads to more engagement. Now, if they want to start making decisions on the basis of who knows what about what to show you and what not, that starts to get them into the editorial realm, think of the power they would have. They could get a mob really upset about something by choosing to share it a lot. They could choose to take something that would otherwise be a controversy and make sure that it becomes the equivalent of the Friday afternoon take out the trash news dump by just not emphasizing it. Facebook Live, there's a riot going on. Is that riot going to be the first thing the next 50,000 people see when they check Facebook? Or will it be there not at all? These are amazingly powerful levers that I'm not sure we should be imploring Facebook to start pulling. The real issue is there's just Facebook. There's just a couple of these platforms, and any decision they make is therefore crazily magnified, and yet the decisions themselves can be narrowly tailored. It might not just be the next 50,000 people, it might just be the next 3 of the 50,000 that are the key people to see this message. And when you look at the kind of portal that those advertising on Facebook have access to, you can see just how finely grained they can target their messages. This is what Facebook purports to know about me on Facebook. I am close friends of women with a birthday in 7 to 30 days. I didn't have that category in my head, but you can imagine for an advertiser that would be very useful to know whether to throw a Zales ad up at me, even though I wouldn't shop there perhaps for myself. I am a close friend of expats. I guess that could be used for the coming bad years when people friends with expats could be questionable. My multicultural affinity is African American, so it's doing its best to figure me out. And the tools that it offers to the advertisers are quite fulsome and automated. So here's an example that I think is another ProPublica special. They chose to send an advertisement for people whose field of study included Jew hater, and Facebook happily told them that's 2274 people, and this is the description. And notice there is a report this is inappropriate, but in the meantime, your audience selection is great. Your potential audience size is 108,000 because we can give you recommendations based on who you're trying to reach of others. So how about Nazis, nationalism, German Schutzstaffel, and bizarrely, Italy, NYC are the organizations that seem to be, through the magic box, tightly correlated. And that's a nice way to start making your audience bigger. Now, these are the kind of things where, you basically tell Facebook you missed a spot, they'll be like, oops, and they'll take it out in an ad hoc fashion. But the real question is, what are we trying to facilitate here? How much do we want them to just be a technology company? And in the more practical and immediate realm, there's things like ads for payday loans that aren't just ads for payday loans that might get shown at the Super Bowl or on a billboard or something like that, but let's use Facebook targeting ultimately, hypothetically, someday not far from now, to find people who are feeling emotionally vulnerable right now. How about that as a category? People who just got laid off. People who are, in some circumstance, vulnerable to a really bad deal. I know it has 256-bit security, and that it's deposited, of all places, in your bank. But this is not going to be a good deal. And thinking about offering it to people right when they might be at their least ability to consider it and to address it appropriately is a real question, I think. And all over the place, we see technology getting deployed that, again, automatically is making associations, offering people what they think is engagement, but in fact is wrong. Here's 2 push alerts, a tale of 2 pushes. This emergency alert, hurricane warning, and the second from Pokemon Go, it's a great time to explore your local parks. What responsibility might the generator of the second push have given the presence of the first? Now, I don't know that this is a new problem I'm raising. I think it's actually quite an old one, but the landscape in which the problem exists is changing. So it used to be that when you went online and searched for stuff, the answers were just a window onto the web, and the search engine was trying to rank them according to something like PageRank. So here's on Bing, should I vaccinate my child? And by my account, 4 of the 5 answers to that are no, you should not vaccinate your child. And if you were to ask Microsoft, coming from the point of view of somebody who thinks vaccination is important to humanity and is scientifically validated, wait a minute, Microsoft, do you have a problem? Their answer would be, no, not so much. I mean, we're not taking a stand on vaccination. We're a technology company, not a scientific publisher. If you don't like what you see, blame the web. And that was the view of Google for many years as well. But more and more, this old-fashioned way of searching for stuff and getting answers back that feels like doing a research paper is not the way people use the web or the internet day to day. They're looking for what's now on the right, which is knowledge graph. It's knowledge that has been distilled, still from wherever they can find it, in ways that is meant to be much more oracular. So this is from a friend of mine, Avishai Margalit. He wrote because he was puzzled. If you Googled him, this is what you would see. And from 2006 to 2011, he was the Kennan professor, which is weird because according to Google, he died in 1962. So he was trying to figure out how to have his life restored. And my answer was, there should be a feedback link at the bottom of your own search result where you can give feedback that says, I am alive, thank you. And just wait. And either they'll change it or eventually you'll die. Either way, it will become accurate at some point or another. And that was strangely not satisfying to him. And I think that when you have this left-hand, right-hand stuff, it may be that what Randall Munroe here calls, this is internet as tool, company as tool. When it's a tool, all right, it's just a tool. Don't blame it for what it does. Over here, it's being your friend. It's trying to tell you something that it is digesting. And if Microsoft were to tell you over here that appendicitis is caused by an imbalance of the four bodily humors, maybe that's a problem for Microsoft, in which discovering it on the left side simply wouldn't be. And as Mark mentioned in the introduction, more and more, we're not searching for stuff that way. We have these digital concierges. I mean, if I actually say, like, hey, Google, I don't know how many phones might go off, so I won't say that. But you see the ways in which these concierges turn out to be our gateway to knowledge. Here are just two examples from the Google Assistant worth pondering.
Is Obama planning a coup?
According to Secrets of the Fed, according to details exposed in Western Center for Journalism's exclusive video, not only could Obama be in bed with the communist Chinese, but Obama may in fact be planning a communist coup d'etat at the end of his term in 2016.
So I have this vision of Google engineers hearing this and being like, darn, they didn't pronounce coup d'etat right. I'll fix that. And it is equal opportunity, by the way. Here is another question.
Google, are Republicans fascists?
According to debate.org, yes, Republicans equals Nazis.
So it's an equal opportunity horrible thing. And it just sounds stranger to me than it did 10 years ago when arguing about individual search results, that the reaction of the companies to their own services telling you false things is like, what do you want from us? My thing back to them has been, at least give Siri a tone of voice. When you ask Siri, like, what's 2 + 2, let her be like 4. And when you ask her, like, are Republicans fascists, let her be like, this is kind of weird, but like she could kind of have a few cracks in the voice to indicate uncertainty. But these kinds of questions are all over the place. And what previously is what the companies would implicitly or explicitly style as, it's a pachinko machine, even we don't know what our search engines are going to deliver up, is no longer available. The tools now are such that you can exquisitely control not just what everybody sees, but what particular people see in response to their own demographic. So I said I was scoping out the problem. Here's my best take of it. For the platforms, there's a real problem with size. It makes every decision they make that is necessarily going to disappoint some people, morally or otherwise, too freighted, because they're so big, they're making a decision for everybody. That's got to change, and there's nothing they can do to just make a more wise policy, given how totalizing they are. Secondly, just how effective they are, thanks to the magic of personalization. That allows for a level of not just teaching people, but kind of manipulating them, that is just too powerful a tool for them to offer to third parties, much less for them to be using themselves, and even if they forswear it themselves. And finally, a problem of accountability. They have some secret set of guidelines as to like what they allow and what they don't, or how they rank and how they don't, and we can't see them, but trust us, we believe in community. That doesn't cut it anymore. It manifestly doesn't cut it anymore. The only problem is, and now this gets to what's the problem for the rest of humanity, we can't agree on what we want. So accountability is great, but to what standard are we holding them accountable? And there would be many views in this very room, and even if we could agree on what we want, we don't trust anybody to give it to us. We don't trust the companies to do it. We don't trust regulators to regulate the companies properly, to do what they should be doing. I assume like Alex Abdo from the Knight First Amendment Institute is like, yes, that's right. Can't trust government to tell companies what they should be doing, which makes it really hard to figure out what the solutions should be. So with these constraints, let's try to explore some solutions. And I think they break down into two categories that track the title of the talk from the food being bad and the portions so big. So we need smaller portions and better food. So let's talk about that. First, let's talk about smaller portions. And for that, I go back to this article about the 84% of digital ad spending. It might be too small. The caption of the photo, inexplicably, because it's just a stock photo of icons, is, there is a belief that to compete with internet giants, companies that are losing revenues to them must turn into giants themselves. Well, problem solved. All right, so that may be what you need to do if you are trying to be the next Facebook, but from a societal humanity point of view, it's not clear that just having different big things solves the problem of bigness. And I would go back to this feed and say there are ways, even short of breaking up Facebook, which Tim Wu, also on this campus probably right now, expounding on his brand new book about bigness, Tim may be ready to break them up. But I would say, no, you can look at the services that Facebook offers and start to think of slices that could introduce littleness within the bigness. So what's an example of that? And this is just hypothetical. Imagine being able, as a person, as a human, to use these sliders to make your own recipe for what should appear next in your feed. Understanding that it's too big a deal for Facebook to try to do it from everybody. And the feedback we give them right now is like, I don't like this. That form of feedback is like a 2x4 across the face of a donkey. It is very unsubtle as feedback. This could be a little more subtle, and you could start to think about what you want out of your feed. Now, how many people are actually going to do it? Probably the same number of people who use IRC in this room. It's not going to be that popular. But you could imagine sharing feed recipes. So Columbia Journalism School goes to the trouble of curating a feed, and you say, you know what, I want 20% of my feed to be coming from the recipe of Columbia Journalism School. Doesn't mean CJS content. It just means they have done the sliders and various things in ways that I am ready to trust them as a proxy. Now, does that mean that people could start getting recipes from who knows where? Yes, they could. They could be getting it from these folks as well, and maybe some of them, somehow by their sliders, would be, quote, unacceptable. I'm not here, though, to solve the filter bubble problem. I'm here to help people be less manipulated in the middle by the platforms. And honestly, if there's some content so terrible it shouldn't be on, then there's just some content so terrible it shouldn't be on, and you deal with that under your abuse, harassment, or other terms of service policies. We actually see pressure on the content side coming not as much from the users, but from the advertisers who say that Unilever is not happy about how often their ads are placed next to toxic content online that starts to tarnish the good brand of Unilever. And they are wanting to have influence. Well, all right, why shouldn't the users on the advertising side have influence as well? Imagine, this is a great idea from Johnny Penn, who is one of our Berkman Klein affiliates, among other things. Johnny says, what if you could, with these different tabs, say, these are the advertisers I would like to hear from when my ad blocker is off, or when I'm using the Facebook app, that is. And maybe they have to have certain pay gap policies that are gender-based. Maybe they have to have a minimum hourly wage. Maybe these are the environmental practices they have to support. You could see actually expressing your values and what ads you want to see in a way that propagates backwards to those who want to advertise to you. And again, you could share those as recipes. And while we're at it, by the way, it just starts to tell us, wow, Facebook has been the only one designing the entire way that Facebook operates for years. It's said at Facebook that if you want to add a new button to Facebook, it requires an act of God, which is to say of Mark. And at least one can dream, right? So if I had root access to the Facebook servers, short of deleting everything, I would add a Voltaire button It's true that I am not an ad person, so it should probably get named something other than that. But the Voltaire button is along the bottom here, and you click it when you see something that you want to say, I completely disagree with this, but I'm so glad you wrote it, thank you. And if you could express that sentiment in a Voltaire, people would start writing stuff to earn Voltaires, and that would become a signal for feed recipes for people to say, I'd like more Voltaires, please. And you'd start seeing content that was actually designed to persuade and enlighten and explain where people were coming from, rather than just to earn the likes of the people that are already going to agree with you. A change like that could have a huge impact on the content flowing through Facebook, and it's just one button. In the meantime, Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, has been disquieted at the state of his own invention, and in particular at the way in which there is a vertical integration with so many of the big totalizing apps between the application and the data. Facebook has your data, and we kind of think, well, of course they do, like that's what they gathered, and now let's tell them to use it wisely. Tim says, what if we were to change it? This is his new project called Solid, and I confess the rollout of Solid perhaps has been a bit amorphous, ironically. So my understanding of it, though, is quite powerful. It's saying, what if you got to say where your data itself got stored? Our friend on IRC could store it in her basement server. The rest of us could choose a proxy to have it somewhere, and a solid pod. And then Facebook has to ask for permission to get to the data every time they want to. If they go bankrupt, you don't lose your data. If they want to push the data to somebody else, it has to go through your solid pod's gatekeeper. If you want to move from Facebook to some other service, you don't have to move your data. Your data is already in the pod, and you can simply open the gate selectively to some other service. It's a really interesting idea that I don't have time to go into more, but it's another example of how dealing with big doesn't have to mean just a breakup. There's lots of technical layers to play with. All right, so that's smaller portions. Let's talk about better food. And for that, I've been working with Jack Balkin, a law professor at Yale, on this idea of information fiduciaries. It's saying that for those who have at least as much data that is sensitive about us, capable of making judgments that are quite powerful about us, think about Facebook knowing when you're going to get into a relationship, shouldn't they at least have to have some of the responsibilities that we rightly expect between a patient and a doctor? You tell the doctor some very sensitive things. The doctor has to respect confidentiality. And most important, the doctor is obliged to be loyal to you with what she does with that information. That doctor has to use it to treat you, not to say, oh boy, have I got somebody to shove some pharmaceuticals at that I'll get a good commission on even though they don't really need it. That would violate the doctor's fiduciary duty. And the same is true of lawyer and client, and as it turns out, between some bankers and financial advisors and their customers in America, that you have to look out for their interests. So Jack and I have a proposal that would say we should make it so these companies want to become fiduciaries. We have a particular plan on how that might happen. It would be the kind of thing that says showing somebody a payday loan when they are at their weakest is not being loyal to them, and the fact that they take the loan is not evidence that, quote, you're giving them what they want. You're giving them something that's bad for them that they would not want to want. And it would also mean, of course, being better about security and having some more direct remedies for that. When Facebook just a couple weeks ago actually lost nearly 50 million users worth of data through a very obscure feature that let you view somebody else's, your own profile as if you were somebody else, this news story about it, people started to circulate on Facebook. It's kind of like Googling Google. And they started getting this message that the action was blocked. You're not allowed to share the story about how Facebook is bad at security on Facebook. Conspiracy theorists blossomed. I do think it was just a kind of misfire of their spam system. But here now, hypothetical. Hypothetical. Imagine that Facebook says, we will promote more that which garners engagement, and that which leads to disengagement with Facebook, we of course will not share at all if we can help it. The ultimate disengagement are people turning off their accounts. If a handful of people read this account about security and are like, yikes, and turn off their accounts, the system designed for engagement would automatically start filtering this out, even though it's not just saying, oh, that's bad for Facebook, I don't want any bad news on Facebook. An engagement-disengagement story could lead to this result. I think over time what we need is less immediately blocking stuff before it even gets posted, but a kind of information recall strategy, like this ladder recall in Australia, the Skyscraper 2000. You know it has to be bad if Australia was like, all right, this ladder can't exist anymore. You could see the same thing for information that goes out that later turns out not to be so reliable. And Facebook has experimented with this, with fact-checking and such, and they've gotten blowback. They're starting to be editors rather than just a technology company. So here's a left-wing group saying that the right-wing group gamed Facebook to get rid of the left-wing content. I don't think it should be Facebook trying to do or even coordinate it all. We have, so far and still, a nation and a world full of great libraries. And those libraries are full of great librarians. These are the librarians at the Library of Congress. And they are skilled. This is their life's work, is to understand sourcing and information and patron service, to help the person who comes in curious about something to answer their questions without judgment about what they're asking about. These folks from their desks could be impaneled in a system kind of like this. Again, artists rendering. All right, they don't like my Voltaire button? How about the keep me posted button? So you see the weird Denver Guardian story, you get outraged. As you're about to share it, you click keep me posted. And what it means is that if enough people click keep me posted on something, a 3-librarian panel is chartered immediately, like the bat signal goes into the sky. And they're like, all right, a lot of people are curious about this. What can you tell us? And the librarians do their thing and show their work. And in fact, if it becomes regular enough, make it a 2-librarian panel with 1 student at a secondary school. And the student contributes to that discussion in a live fire exercise. And that student gets graded by his or her teacher in school as to how well they contributed. This is the kind of thing that could have people see something and then later see, oh, I see, that's the rest of the story. It doesn't exist. All right, good to know. That starts to cultivate in a very applied way the kind of media literacy skills we are so desirous of the public having. And finally, aside from those sort of kind of kaleidoscope of possible solutions and interventions, I think there's something that binds them together that I loosely call ethos. And if we were business school types, it's like a core purpose exercise where your board goes on retreat and they have to come up in a single sentence or clause with what the company stands for. So here are some of the core purposes of companies: Cargill, to improve the standard of living around the world; 3M, to solve unsolved problems innovatively. I think that is in fact grammatical, but you get what 3M is all about. Fannie Mae, to strengthen the social fabric by continually democratizing home ownership. All right, that is a former core purpose. I think it has evolved in the past few years. And one of my favorites, Nike, to experience the emotion of competition, winning and crushing competitors. So what is our ethos? What is the ethos we want, especially of the bigs who are so singular about channeling information to and from us? And I think again of like healthcare. You could have different ethoi, I think is the plural of ethos, but I won't use it. Different ethoses. National Academy of Medicine does a healthy longevity grand challenge to get researchers thinking about longevity. There's also a more .com ethos about it. Just a couple weeks ago, there's a company promising elixir of youth with young blood transfusion. And they're going to open a New York clinic as of the end of September. I don't know if anybody has tried this yet, and if you're feeling better as a result, but that would just be anecdote, so don't tell us. In fact, don't do this. So what is our core purpose? What are we here to do? And I turned to the Columbia Journalism School website to see what the Columbia Journalism School says as its core purpose. And what strikes me so much about this, global, influential, innovative, one of the leading journalism schools in the world, also one of the oldest, our tradition rooted in the bedrock values of ethics and excellence, but also leaders of cutting-edge journalistic innovation and media scholarship. What strikes me about this is perhaps written at a time when the journalistic values of ethics and excellence didn't need to be expounded upon, because we all know what that means. And I'm not sure that that's as true anymore. So I actually found myself looking to The Guardian, which has a strange structure. It's not a normal newspaper. It's run by a trust, and the Scott Trust. And in 1921, on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of The Guardian then, the editor, C.P. Scott, no coincidence that name, did an essay about what he saw as the ethos of that paper and of journalism generally. And among the many well-known lines are the assertions, comment is free, but facts are sacred, that newspapers have a moral as well as a material existence, and the voices of opponents, no less than that of friends, has a right to be heard. And other values as well, that are values that, I don't know, does Facebook need to subscribe to this? Yes. Does Twitter? If so, what would that make it look different than it does now that it does not? And if we cannot rely on them to do it, how might we infuse those values into the, dare I call it, supply chain from the origination of ideas to their editing and mangling and processing until they appear in front of eyeballs and ears around the world through the conveyances of these big platforms. And I think really it may be less trying to get them through a core purpose at the corporate level to answer that question and to act, but rather to think and realize that these companies comprise people. And maybe they can be themselves professionals in the fullest sense of the word. The learned professions are those professions that traditionally required such advanced learning that by the time you had it, you were a very powerful person in the world. And what you did on behalf of, say, your clients or your patients would affect their lives and could affect the world. And therefore, you have higher ideals you have to subscribe to, maybe even as against the company you work for. And the very first three learned professions from the 18th century were divinity, law, and medicine. Each of them, again, highly trained people with access to their respective levers of power. And the state, science, and the supernatural. And finally, at the turn of the 19th century, a fourth learned profession was added. I don't know if anybody can guess the fourth learned profession. If you guessed surveying, you'd be right. That was the fourth learned profession, because it's really important to get the boundaries right on real property. So maybe it's time to think of more learned professions. My sense is that journalists consider themselves a learned profession. Librarians, academics, and yes, maybe data scientists should be members of a learned profession, because they're the ones that will first see, my gosh, with this beaker of data, we could change an election. What do we do? I don't know, you touch it. Like, that's the kind of thing that we at least want people to have as a conversation, and realizing that they may not be in the Justice League of data scientists tut-tutting everyone else from the safety of their Corinthian columned room. This is a colleague of mine in Harvard Computer Science, June 30, 2010. Congratulations, Matt, you've got tenure. And November of 2010, why I'm leaving Harvard. Matt, let's say it's not so. What happened? Well, one simple reason. I love the work I'm doing at Google. I can hack all day working on problems that are orders of magnitude larger and more interesting than I can work on at any university. Sad trombone for me as one of the people left behind. And that's the kind of thing that asks us, okay, but can you bring your academic values with you to the company that you're now going to work for, just as you see people from the companies occasionally donning robes and saying, all right, academia, there's something fun about that. And I credit Mark. Mark has already said he's behind the Billionaire's Pledge. He has said he is giving away 99% of what I think is a fortune around $100 billion to an order of magnitude. He's going to give it away. He thinks big sometimes about Facebook as almost a government itself and thinking about experiments about governance. He's realizing there's something new and different going on and thinking about the values that could be introduced that are values from the existing professions that should be embedded behind this box when you search. I don't think that should be too far a reach. And indeed, about that box, this is a paper from 1998 talking about the dangers of search engines that were simply in the corporate realm with no ethos of the learned professions in it, concluding that the issue of advertising in particular causes enough mixed incentives that it's crucial to have a competitive search engine transparent in the academic realm. Who wrote that paper in 1998? That's right, Sergey Brin and Larry Page. This is the paper that introduced Google to the world, and it was written while they were graduate students at Stanford. Now, I don't know if their view is still the same, but I could see ways in which trying to think of the values of the professions that don't just exist in their islands, but suffuse what we see in the corporate world, how to get that pipeline going again, how to get those frequencies resonating again. And you could even see P2P, professional to professional communication, a bat phone indeed, so that if a Wall Street Journal editor is seeing something that might be fake news and really can't tell, God, this deep fake is awfully persuasive, and there's so much of it, whether it's a fake Facebook ad from Russia trying to get people in a particular town in Idaho to show up for an event as if it were the Idahoans themselves creating it, or creating other kinds of, dare I call them false flags, or even these sorts of academic results that show how you can make Vladimir Putin or any other figure say anything you want, to be able to have that bat phone and say, look, I know it's all over Twitter. I don't want to be late to this story, but I also don't want to promote it if I'm going to be embarrassed later. Be able to call the experts on deepfakes who can be like, yeah, rest easy. The shadows are all wrong. The artifacts aren't right. You should pass on this one. At least it prevents that story from crossing the blood-brain barrier from the swamps of Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit into the mainstream media, so that the mainstream media actually has a differentiator. And the final piece of that puzzle, to me, is understanding that when governments are involved, it is a lot to ask of the companies, that the companies somehow figure out how to defend and identify against it. The governments, some of them are incredibly well-resourced, and it's just too much to ask. This is, again, 1999, the United States Air Force Psychological Operations document. Here it is. Planned operations, this is what a PSYOP is, to convey selective information and indicators to foreign audiences to influence their emotions, motives, objective reasoning, and ultimately the behavior of foreign governments, organizations, etc., to induce or reinforce foreign attitudes and behavior favorable to the... Wow, what a great kind of pithy definition of what we feel like we're facing on defense today that was certainly part of our literal playbook as the United States in 1999. And thinking about the profession of diplomats, of political scientists, of others, thinking about the game theoretic implications of this, and when we should all say, all right, we're going to take that off the table and figure out how to police it, that's not such a bad idea either. There's just too much government-to-government stuff that we have to think through and cannot handle alone. I remember the time when, however good I felt I was at other technologies, I could not set the clock on my VCR. I'll talk to the person who used IRC afterwards, see how to do that. But basically, the technology that we love so much is redolent of Arthur C. Clarke's third law. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And there's something great about that. That's the Apple ethos. It just works. It's great. It only has one button. No, it has no buttons. You just gesticulate vaguely at it. It knows what you want. He was actually borrowing from Lee Brackett, witchcraft to the ignorant, simple science to the learned. who are the learned among us, and what are their responsibilities to see that the magic that we accept as even beyond a force of nature, it is supernatural, is working in our interest? That is the challenge in front of all of us. And another kind of graphical way of representing it that the statisticians among us are going to hate is kind of a histogram of, you got nerds in the corner. Those are the folks that know how it's done. They know how to operate in a way that they're not subject to many of the forces that might influence and constrain them. Good for them. There are Luddites in the other corners. They're not technologically literate, and they don't care to be. They've still got old-fashioned books, as long as there are still bookstores, and there are still a few, at least in Manhattan. And for the rest of us, exactly what's going to happen here is the sweet spot. And the role that for those of you who are aspiring journalists that you'll have to play, both in advancing your profession in all areas that are contested, which is to say all of them, and also in holding in particular the flows of technology to account that are so affecting the way that journalism is done and distributed and, yes, paid for. That's, of course, what we focus on next. Thank you very much. I think I either have from Karen the peace sign or an indication that we should have two questions. Two questions for which there is a microphone in the middle of the room looking lonely. Wow. Going once. Oh, going twice? No, that guy is going twice. He's just going. No, he's going to ask a question. And feel free, if you like, to tell us who you are. I am led to understand this is being live streamed.
Hi, my name's Will. I'm in the dual degree, major combining journalism and computer science. So I really enjoyed your lecture. Thought it was thought-provoking. I was just curious, the kind of solutions you provided for making Facebook better.
Yes.
They all seem very much against the self-interest of Facebook and its shareholders. So I was wondering, the only way to do that is kind of to force them. So who has the power to force Facebook, or how, is there any realistic way it can be done?
Yes, I think there is. And you're right that paying attention to the incentives of the various players is vital. Because it's even one thing to actually impose some regulation, but how they will treat it, how they will abide by it is all going to be affected by their incentives. And we see that by Apple being suddenly the new tribune of privacy for everybody, because their business model happens to be one that doesn't require the exploitation of sensitive personal data. So I agree with you, incentives are nearly everything. The grand bargain that was just flashed up on the screen that Jack and I have proposed is one in which, as kind of a one-time deal, we would, the United States, pass a law that says that you can be a fiduciary, and here are all the obligations that incurs. You're not going to like a lot of them. Like, you got to stop polluting certain streams. That will impact your margin, but so be it. But it's your choice. You can keep going as you're going, or you can be a fiduciary. So what's in it for you to be a fiduciary? We will exempt you from some state-level law, possibly including class action suits under state law, the shareholder derivative suits, things like that. Now we're starting to speak in a language that the most cynical corporate operator could understand. And tuning that bargain is a dangerous deal, make no mistake. But I think that's one way to make it so Facebook would say, you know what, I'll take that option, or at least I don't object to you passing a law that gives me the option, and then I can choose later whether or not I want to take it. In fact, each company can choose. That's one example of trying to work with the incentives you say. Now, whether we can throw a Voltaire button in, surely not. But we could say that part of a fiduciary is to allow users to have more interoperability with the data that they have created, which means anybody could write a Facebook skin on top of the Facebook data. And there are already some interesting exemplars of that. Gobo.social from Ethan Zuckerman at the Media Lab is an effort to let you alter your feeds by having it slurp a bunch of stuff, and then according to your sliders, it will show you the stuff you want. These are examples of how to sneak in a button like that. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sabrina, and I'm a full-time MS student here at Columbia Journalism School. And my question for you is regarding what you said about the smaller portions, better food. So if as a media company, I would like to become a provider of those smaller portions and better food, and I would like to try to create more quality content for a more targeted audience, but most people are already so accustomed to platforms such as Facebook and Twitter and so forth. What is the solution, and how do you draw attention back to those platforms that are more authoritative and providing better content?
Yes, and my hope, I think, is not to try to just compete to get Facebook to say, okay, we'll throw you a bone and we'll emphasize you. They actually have a great program that is the local news program that is specifically trying to emphasize local news generally, those small portions within the feed, and how to figure out what counts as local news. Lots of thorny technical issues on it because the company made a decision that local news is important. And I am glad they did, and I support that program. In the more general case, though, to make it so that different people would have different recipes, and one of the sliders is local versus non-local, and then I can start using local personalities to help fill my feed, and their choices become sort of my choices. That would be a way to see, especially when your audience doesn't have to be the whole world. It might be that what you're providing is of interest to a very distinct but passionate smaller group of people. To help connect with that, I think fragmenting the way that feeds get created could really help with that. That would be my hope. So, all right, thank you all. I'm given to understand there's a reception down the hallway. Thank you.
Thank you. Jonathan's right. There's a reception across the way. Please join us.